Thank you for joining us. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. We'd also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nintukiwut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Good evening. My name is Ailsa Craig, and I'm the incoming interim dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm very excited to be participating in this third Coastline event featuring Megan Gail Coles and her incredible novel, Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club. One thing that I do have to address up front is that Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club contains some difficult scenes of sexual, physical, and psychological violence. So please be aware that our discussion tonight might include some disturbing content. Anyone watching who might find this traumatic is able to leave at any time, but also please note that support is available through bridgethegap.com and the Warm Line telephone support for non-emergencies if you're calling from outside St. John's. The number is 1-855-753-2560, and from within St. John's, it's 709-753-2560. Coastlines is a book club for the entire Memorial community, alumni, students, staff, faculty, and friends. And although these are very strange days that we're living through, it must be said that it's a great time for connection through reading. So we're sharing experiences even though we need to stay apart. And our book club is specifically highlighting Newfoundland writers and those who are graduates of Memorial. Coastlines is designed to highlight the rich history, culture, and personality of this place. I'll now pass officially the host duties over to Angela Antle, a CBC writer and producer and host, among many other accomplishments, and also a current Memorial PhD student. I'll motion to you on my screen, but I don't know exactly where you are, but passing it to you.
Thanks, Dr. Craig. I'm really pleased to be here hosting the third Coastlines Book Club tonight. And we're discussing Megan Gail Coles' Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club. And I remember the first time I read one of Megan's short stories, the raw energy of her writing just left me breathless. I've always since then thought of her as Megan Gail, G-A-L-E, Coles, because it's like a gale blowing through when you read her writing. One reviewer lauded this book for its glorious use of language. So if you haven't read it, I hope after tonight's event you will. The novel takes place during a wretched snowstorm in St. John's in February, one of the hardest months of the Newfoundland calendar, on one of the hardest days of that month for many, Valentine's Day. It's set inside the Hazel, which is a fine dining establishment. And as the blizzard rages outside, another storm brews inside, one that exposes class, gender, sexual, and racial inequalities amongst the employees and their customers. The tension is taut throughout, and it builds to a sort of festering point, bringing the characters to a head. This novel is fierce, it's funny, it's unapologetic, and ultimately quite inspiring for so many reasons. We have a killer book club here tonight. In addition to Dr. Craig, we have Sharon Bala, who's an acclaimed and multiple award-winning author of the book Boat People and Memorial's writer-in-residence currently. So welcome to Sharon. And we have Jason Sellars, a seventh-generation Newfoundlander from Grand Falls. He is a rug hooker, a puppeteer, an arts educator at the Rooms, an alumnus of Grenfell, and he has a personal connection to much of the subject matter explored in the novel. He's going to talk a little bit about that. One of the connections is that Jason, on occasion, moonlights as the bartender at the Inn of Old, although the Inn of Old, I think, is quite different from the Hazel. We're going to talk about how Jason identifies with the novel shortly. Welcome, Jason. To our wider book club members and viewers, you can post your questions at any time on YouTube. The incredible Coastline producers, Heidi Wicks and Janet Harron and John Duff, will post the questions up there and I'll ask them on your behalf. And thank you to John for being our technical spirit guide this evening. All right, I'm going to introduce our honored guest, Megan Gail Coles. Megan is a graduate of Memorial and the National Theatre School of Canada and UBC. She's the co-founder and artistic director of Poverty Cove Theatre Company, for which she has written numerous award-winning plays: Our Eliza, The Battery, Bound, Squawk, Grace, and Falling Trees. Her debut short fiction collection, Eating Habits of the Chronically Lonesome, won the BMO Winterset Award, the Relit Award, the Margaret and John Savage First Book Award, and earned her the Writers' Trust of Canada's 5x5 Prize. Her debut novel, the one we're discussing tonight, Small Game Hunting, was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and a contender for CBC Canada Reads, and recently won the BMO Winterset Award. Megan is originally from Savage Cove on the Great Northern Peninsula. She lives in St. John's, where she is executive director of Riddle Fence and a PhD candidate at Concordia University. Megan's debut poetry collection, Satched, is forthcoming from the House of Anansi. Welcome to Coastlines, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this evening.
So I have a feeling tonight's discussion is going to be quite vibrant. But before we dig into the book, I'd love for you to treat us to a reading, Megan.
So I'm going to read from Small Game Hunting, which is actually written in 3 distinct sections. And those sections are meant to be reflective of the sections of a typical day of service in a restaurant, because the novel takes place in a restaurant. And so I thought I would read tonight from the beginning, which is prep. Olive waits below the sad mural painted in memory of some long ago drowned boy. She can see up and down Duckworth Street from her perch, though there's not much to see this early in the morning. A scattered taxi slogs by, carrying fiendish-looking passengers who attempt to discreetly smoke from barely cracked windows. Discretion is a skill they have fallen out with, but they don't know that yet. They still fancy themselves stealth, piling 4 park-applied humans into a single toilet stall, scarves dangling beneath the door, telling tales on them all. Volume control is a thing of delusion in the confined spaces they inhabit. It will be years before this is fully realized by those who escape the scene or are thrown into adulthood by overdose or pregnancy. These lucky few will feel overwhelmingly retroactively embarrassed by their one-time rock star fantasies. Olive can hear them bawling about their supposed betrayals as clouds of tobacco smoke and slurry syllables updraft skyward through the slightly parted window. But Olive forgives them their make-believe follies. They are no better or worse than most of the half-well-off, half-grown-up humans she has met. They are just flawed and vulnerable to the pitch. Olive is no different. She has chased the white dragon into smoky rooms where grad students complained about unkindly thesis feedback while wearing $1,000 watches. A holiday tanned winter wrist, a baggie held aloft, another Volvo fob serving key bumps round the ring. Under such circumstances, Olive is for the most part silent. She can pass for one of them until she releases language into the world. She is not a card-carrying member of the townie majority. Rarely are there other fugitive faces for Olive to hide behind on nights when she wants to get on the go. There was a Mexican painter once, a Russian musician. There was that one Pakistani fellow whose name Olive could never recall. She did not think it was unpronounceable. She just could not pronounce it. There are lots of words still beyond her reach. Like Olive can think of no words to describe the pain felt where her pants nearly meet her feet. She winces and tucks her chin further inside her coat. She tries to push her neck back to save from catching skin in the zipper. She sniffs back hard and swallows a slippery lob. Her grandmother would not approve of hoarding mucus in the body, but her grandmother would not approve of much of what she does lately. Olive sighs and swells and swallows spit to slide the lava line. Allie, my dolly, get a tissue. Her grandmother's voice is always a program running in the back of her mind. But Olive can't sacrifice a tissue on mere mucus this morning. Her store of napkins is running low, and the last time she tried to hawk and spit, the wind gust blew snot back onto her sleeve. The line of mucus running from her lips to her elbow turned her weak stomach over. A middle-aged woman in a bright blue Canada goose coat muttered, "Oh, for the love of God," as she hurried past the translucent boundary. This made Olive feel gross, so she swallows that gross feeling down while she waits. She can distract herself for a time from the damp soak settling into her heels by watching the craven-faced, respectable people meander to the grown-up jobs after a weekend of pretending to be 25. But they are not 25. They are not even 35 and feel as such. Most internally promise to stay home with the kids next weekend as they turn their faces to or from the sunshine, depending on the quantity of painkillers ingested in the car. This temporary commitment to sobriety is bookended by revolving party systems. Some relish vitamin D, while others resent it. The division, though, will not last long, as the sun already has started to duck back inside the nimbostratus. It will snow again today as surely as the nearly 40 will go out again in 4 days' time. The babysitter will be called. The cat will be let in. They will flee their houses for a little look around. Get the stink of house off ya. They will reliably cloak this smell of domestication in alcohol and nicotine and self-loathing until Monday. Mondays are for quitting everything. Again. Except when it storms on Monday. Then quitting everything is pushed to Tuesday. Today is such a Tuesday. The weekend warriors refuse to sell out and so have fully bought in pound for pound. Olive is just the same. She too had been sold the notion of party drugs as lazy fun and then fast gobbled them hand over fist. Swallow, snort, smoke. Ingestion is an irrelevant matter of personal preference and ease. There is no wall to wall them out or in. Drug trends are trending regardless of national media reports daily updating all of their progress east and upward. Olive has watched the same scenes play out on repeat in dark corners of the late night since arriving in St. John's. They've gone and stashed the kits everywhere to protect against the siren call. A first line of defense kept behind wine bars, under the bathroom sink, in purses. And Olive knows she must address the long list of reasons why self-Medicare is needed to comfort her. Eventually. But today, right now, before all else, she must get inside somewhere to prevent worse from happening. She covets the dashboard heaters inside those coked up cabs. Olive hears the latch squeal before the hinges squeak. A black arm heaves garbage bags onto the sidewalk, one after the other. There are so many, more waste than is normal. Food that went off during the previous day's storm is now bagged and tossed out for the collectors, who will not come until it fully clears. Olive worries the birds will have at it. Omi will be blamed for the weather's interference in the city schedule if he doesn't recollect it. Olive wills him to remember, so he won't get in trouble. Omi is from Nigeria. Olive thinks he is her age, but she can't be sure. She's been trying to figure out how to ask without seeming ignorant or making him angry. She has never seen him angry, but is still afraid ignorant questions might jeopardize their friendship. She didn't even know they were friends until he said, one day, weeks ago, she was waiting for Iris. He approached her in the sidewalk. "Girl, you okay?" Olive didn't know how to answer this honestly, so shook her head. Omi was staring at her skeptically. She worried there was something on her face and her teeth. She dug through her pockets, hoping he would think her busy searching out some important thing. she muttered quietly to the ground before adding, "I'm good," as a hurried afterthought. "Excuse me?" "I'm good," Olive had barked, much too loudly, and Omi put up his palms in mock terror. Thank you.
Thank you. It was so great to hear you read your book. I've never heard you read from it before. And I heard you say on the CBC morning show the other morning how important it was for you to record the audiobook. Do you want to talk about what that experience was like?
Well, the kind of inspiration or the necessity for recording the book myself stems from the fact that I hadn't heard a lot of audiobooks narrated by the author, especially marginalized authors. I hadn't had a lot of experiences where there were a diversity of voices narrating these books. For a very long time, a lot of our books, our audio books and commercials, and any kind of voiceover that would be present in our media was done by people with British accents or Canadian accents. And it kind of goes against the intention of the novel to be representative of different people in Newfoundland. And so it was really important to me that the voice that was coming through to people be representative of the people that the book was supposed to be written for and inspired by. And Jill Kiley and Don Ellis actually helped me with the recording. Jill was the director on the project, and Don was the sound engineer. And we did it in their studio last summer, last July, I believe, when we went back to a level that allowed for social distancing. And it was a really interesting experience. It's quite, I would say, taxing to read a book like this out loud to yourself.
You had a dream team anyway to record it. They're wonderful. And I should point out too, speaking of dream teams, the photos that we saw during your reading are by Richie Perez, who's an amazing photographer, works at MUN. And thanks to him for those images. I think they really fit with the reading quite a bit. There's Richie there. Yeah. So I know our panelists have a whole bunch of questions ready. And also I hope that you viewers out there will throw some questions at us too. So you can just type your questions into YouTube at any time and we'll make sure we get to them throughout the evening. I think, we just want to have a conversation, a flowing conversation. So we're going to start things off with Sharon Bala, who always has a bunch of questions up her sleeve. And I'll throw it to you, Sharon.
Megan, your book makes you think of a kind of maybe unexpected, comprehensive comparative title, which is George Eliot's Middlemarch, because both of those books are really generous in terms of the cast of characters and also in terms of how much empathy both of you as writers bring to all of your characters, even the ones who are maybe less savory, shall we say. But I have a question about point of view. So I was thinking about this as you read, that in your book, there's like close third person, right? We get really close into Olive and Iris and like just this huge cast of characters. But at the same time, there's a very clear narrator kind of floating almost omnisciently above, kind of coming in with these snarky little asides. And some of the humor really comes through the narrative voice, which I love. Was that, so I have a two-part question. The first part is, was that a conscious decision or was that something that organically happened in writing? And then the second question is, did you have other voices, other close third person voices who didn't make the cut? Were there other characters we would have heard from who didn't make the cut?
Okay, so the narrator, the omnipresent narrator, was considerably more present in initial drafts of the book. And that is very similar to me choosing to narrate the book. In a way, it's I'm taking ownership of the narrative. And so I typically don't ask more of the readership, or require the person, even the characters, to be any more vulnerable inside of the story than I am myself. And so that was kind of me, as the author, as like a Newfoundland woman, taking kind of responsibility for what was happening, driving the story from a perspective that is very kind of specific to my lived experience and to the lived experience of women of rural, remote, marginalized backgrounds. I do think it's important sometimes when you're trying to tell a story that has a lot of context to have a lot of different character voices. And so there is a quite large cast. And while no one didn't make it, there were characters that I had considered maybe evolving further. So Amanda, for example, Cal's sister, kept coming through in Cal's storyline. Like, his mother and sister were voices that felt really necessary in his storyline for me, and so I considered developing them like further, but it didn't seem necessary. I feel like where Calvin ends up in the dark at the end of the book, it kind of achieved all of the goals that I would have set out for myself had I explored Amanda further.
Thank you.
Sharon, did you want to ask another question now, or do you want to save one?
Maybe I'll save one. I have
Okay.
many questions, so
I know.
you gotta cut
You
me
always
off.
have good questions. Yeah. So we've got a video question now. We're going to go to Amy Anthony. So there's like a B storyline to this whole book club tonight, and that is Grand Falls people. And Amy is from Grand Falls. Jason is from Grand Falls, and I'm from Grand Falls. And I think there's someone else too that's going to show up. But Amy is a Grenfell grad. She's about to open her own restaurant at the site of the Big R on Harvey Road. So for people who've been following her Instagram and wondering where, that's where. And it's going to be called the Nook and Cannery. And the reason I bring that up is that restaurants play into her question. So here's Amy.
Hi, Megan. Amy Anthony here on Hayward Avenue, hanging out in some rain. And just wondering, I'm about to open my own restaurant here in the city, and wondering how you feel the service industry could change if there were more women or non-binary folks owning and operating.
Megan, did you work in restaurants?
No, I worked primarily in the bar industry. Did Amy ask her question? I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues, I think.
Oh yeah, her question was, do you think having more women or non-binary people involved in the restaurant industry would change things here in St. John's?
Right. Okay. I can't actually see anybody anymore, so I'm just doing this blind now. So everyone will have to forgive me if I hesitate. I think
No problem.
in any industry, we require representation from all the people that are present in our society in order to maintain accountability. So obviously the restaurant industry would benefit greatly from having women and non-binary folk in positions of power, people who've had different lived experiences, and people who have definitely had different experiences in the service industry, because their perspective has likely been missing. Like, we only have one perspective, or we have a dominant narrative that kind of prescribes how things should be from their particular lived experience, then we're going to not see a fulsome picture, because no one can be responsible for knowing how everyone feels and how everyone's day is different and challenging. And so I would argue that not only will we benefit from having women and non-binary folk, but I would suggest we have people of different backgrounds and different classes and education levels be in positions where they can inform how the work is done. I also think with regards to the restaurant industry, people who've been marginalized would advocate for better labor relations and like stronger working conditions, because they have unfortunately been taken advantage of and exploited traditionally in a lot of these roles. And so that would allow us to have a safer and more robust kind of work environment for our members of our service industry.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I'm going to ask you a question now while we try to figure out the technical challenges that you're having, because we can still see you. So that's the main thing. I want to ask you about empathy and how, Sharon touched on it, but there's so much empathy for your characters. You lovingly write them and talk about their struggles, but there's also an undercurrent of, I'm going to say, anger, like righteous anger in there as well. How do you balance those two things? You do it so well, and I'd love to hear you discuss just how.
I think it's unfortunately really easy to demonize people who have done things that we don't agree with. Like, we're very quick to judge, and unfortunately we're very hesitant to provide space and patience for someone's point of view that we don't agree with. And while I don't necessarily share the same values as some of the more misogynistic characters in the book, I think it is important to consider where these values came from, what informed these behaviors, because without actually looking into how this developed in our communities, in our families, in our society, we can never really address the problem. It'll just continue to self-perpetuate. And so while we might not want to become close or intimate with someone who is potentially predatory or dangerous or racist or any number of horrible things, it is necessary to learn about each other and to keep some kind of dialogue open in order to potentially like bridge that communication gap so that we might maybe come a little closer. I feel like our province and our country and our world, unfortunately, has become very divisive, and the language around people lacks a lot of compassion and empathy for what it is maybe that they're going through or what they have inherited in their lived experience. And that doesn't do anything to actually make anyone safer. The less we know about each other, the more dangerous our environment is. The less we know about each other, the more distrustful we are of one another. And that distrust like kind of fosters an environment where everyone is very fearful and nothing very productive can come when you're constantly reacting to fear.
Yeah, I agree. Very well said. I'm going to throw to one of the next video questions, and my dog is going to ask a question too. If you can't hear the video, I'll just tell you what she said. So this is a question from Emily Bridger, filmmaker, and here she is.
Hello, Meg and everybody. I'm very honored to be here on my phone to ask you a question about your brilliant novel. So something I really loved about this novel was how your story happens within the confines of a day of service at a restaurant. I think that works so well thematically in terms of themes of hierarchy and trauma, but also structurally, I loved how it was divided up into, the day of service, you have prep, lunch, dinner, which I also think really helped build intensity in a very intense novel. Leading up to that dinner time climax, that boiling point. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your decision to set this story in a restaurant, and also within one day. Did you always have the intention to do that? Did you set out to write with that in mind, or was that something that came about later? And I guess I'm wondering if you did set out to write it in that structure, I'm wondering how that day of service structure informed your story. Thanks.
Okay, Megan. So that was Emily Bridger. She's a writer and filmmaker, an actor from St. John's. She's an alumna of MUN as well. And her first feature film, Little Orphans, premiered at the Atlantic Film Festival in 2020 and won the Borsos Award for the Best Canadian Feature at the Whistler Film Festival. And her question had to do with the structure of your novel and how you structured it in 3 parts, as you said before the reading, over an evening of service and sort of ending with the boiling point of dinner being served. Did you always have that structure in mind, or did that evolve as you edited the book?
The concept of having the restaurant narrative spaced inside 3 different service sections was always very clear to me before I started writing the novel. And there's also embedded inside of these 3 sections something that would be inherent to post-traumatic stress thinking patterns. And so in prep, you have this looping that occurs. And then in the next section, you have the looping as it accelerates. And then finally, in the last section, the acceleration is to a point where it's almost frantic. And this is reflective of how trauma accumulates in the body. And unfortunately, trauma is a kind of an accumulative thing that we have to deal with, people who suffer. And people, thankfully, not everyone has a lot of experience with trauma in their lives. And I think they're very fortunate to have lived a relatively pleasant life. But that does not allow for them necessarily to fully comprehend that a person that is experiencing struggles and obstacles are often experiencing those struggles and obstacles in a whole variety of areas of their lives. And so these things compound. And unfortunately, that makes them also targets in our community. They are people that end up kind of being preyed upon by individuals who are also damaged and don't necessarily know how to manage their lives in a way that would make them safe for relationships with others. And so the structure of the novel is intended to prepare you for what is about to happen. So it accelerates in that fashion on purpose so that the reader is fully immersed in the thinking patterns of the characters by the time we reach the climax.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's really brilliant. That's fantastic. Because it was such a craft question, maybe it's time to talk a little bit about some of the Newfoundland titles that you're reading or that you'd recommend. So we have a slide that we're going to show of some of the Newfoundland books that you chose to talk about tonight. And maybe we're not going to see that slide. Oh, there's the slide. Do you remember what's on the slide, Megan?
I suspect that there's a Lisa Moore and a Joel Thomas Hines. I like to quip, and I don't know if Lisa and Joel are fond of this particular comment that I make regularly in interviews, but I like to quip that I sometimes feel like I'm their literary love child, that they don't know whether or not they necessarily want to be responsible for anymore, because I'm fully off leash at this point. And I guess that really is a reflection of the fact that Lisa was writing these really fully developed female characters in a way that I hadn't met on the page, especially Newfoundland women that had like these very full lives, like lives that had all kinds of desires and different passions. There were characters that I hadn't read before. They were contemporary Newfoundland women, living in the world that was familiar to me. And while that was really exciting for me and gave me this ability to identify what potentially I wanted to do in my writing career, like I remember thinking, I didn't even know that was like a thing that I could do with the rest of my life until I read Open. This still wasn't exactly like what I thought my writing world would look like or sound like, and I won't use the words that I sometimes use when referring to Joel's book Down to the Dirt, because Heidi is like kind of cautioned me against certain salty language that I use to describe Down to the Dirt. But there was a voice, a rural Newfoundland voice in Joel's work that I recognized, the voice that I grew up hearing on the wharf, like in the shed, like when you're trying to go get your dad to come home for supper, you heard those voices, you knew those people. And I felt like some combination of these two Newfoundland writers was where I would potentially land. And so that's often why when people ask me what my influences are in our local literary scene, I spring to Joel and Lisa. Now, obviously, there's Kathleen Winter, Michael Crummy, Wayne Johnston. They wrote like a lot of like diverse fiction and poetry. And so there were different things that influenced like how you thought about how a narrative or how a poem could be structured. I think a lot of people find my prose to have like a very poetic kind of lyrical quality to it. And so those are the reasons that I included the other authors in this list, but the list could go on and on and on. It's very difficult, in fact, to just choose 5.
Yes, that's true for sure. I think Sharon, I can just tell that Sharon has a question about craft. She's just like vibrating over there in the corner of the screen.
Well, I mean, when you were talking about trauma and how you infused trauma in the structure of the book, it made me think about all of the things that when we work on books for a very long time, that we bake into the book that maybe the reader senses but doesn't actually see on the page, all that subtext. Do you sometimes get, and I was also thinking, I wrote down the word demanding because I think your book is very demanding. But when I say demanding, I mean it in the way that I also mean the word ambitious, in the sense that sometimes the word ambition is thrown against particularly women as a criticism, and I always take it as praise. And so I think when a book demands something of the reader, it is actually demanding much more of the author. This is not a question, I'm just saying things. But can you talk a bit about the demanding parts of writing, the parts that you find frustrating, difficult, the parts that, like, the parts of craft that really, that you struggle with the most?
Well, I'm going to speak to demanding and ambitious at first, because
Yes.
that's something that I think requires a little bit of fleshing out. I am a demanding person, and I suppose in a way, this is the result of not being demanding for such a long time. This is a result of feeling and having the implicit memory that I was meant to demand very little of not just my self, but of others and of society, of my community, because of who I was, where I was born, when I was born. That was very it was made clear throughout my life that like you didn't necessarily want to be recognized or identified as an ambitious woman or someone who had too many opinions. I think it's very commonplace for people to feel like, especially if they were growing up at the same time as me, for young girls to feel like they should be seen and not heard. Like it was pretty prevalent throughout my cultural experience. And so I kind of have totally abandoned this particular pursuit. And now I have kind of embraced this idea that if I want other women and marginalized people to communicate their experiences and voice their concerns, then I also have to do that. Like you can't expect of others what you don't have necessarily the courage to do yourself, or I choose not to behave like that, to conduct myself that way in the world. And so whether or not someone else wants to be quite as forthright as me is their own personal choice, but this is kind of how I'm rolling with it right now. I think there are different kinds of people and different kinds of art in our society, and some art, for example, is cake, right? Some art is kind of delicious and it's meant to make you feel all warm and fuzzy inside.
If you say your book is kale, I'm going to be very upset.
I am definitely not cake. And perhaps it is not something that initially you want to like consume because it might not be as comforting or as easy or sweet on the senses, but it's necessary occasionally to eat other things besides cake to sustain yourself, to make yourself strong so that you can go out in the world and achieve things and improve things and contribute in different ways. And so everybody has a different function in our arts and culture community. And I guess I'm definitely in the leafy green family.
Cabbage? Are you saying you're a cabbage?
No, not cabbage. Come on. Something more complex and hearty with lots of fiber.
I do think that I also want authors in our community, emerging writers, to write whatever book they need to write. And so for a very long time, you kind of experienced a lot of Canadian literature that was written in the exact same structure and had the same kinds of sentences and the same kinds of descriptions. Like, I'm never going to wax poetic about the prairies or wheat fields or anything like that. And I'm certainly not going to romanticize the ocean. The ocean is dangerous. Like, you can drown. And so in writing a novel that is so specifically unique to me, I am also suggesting to emerging writers that they should write whatever novel is unique to them. And in that way, we will then create a really robust and interesting and innovative canon of fiction. I shouldn't sound like Joel. You shouldn't sound like Lisa. We should all sound differently. And that's kind of what I'm trying to like support in like the creative development process in my community.
I love that answer.
Great. I know Dr. Craig wants to ask a question too, so over to her.
You can actually see me chomping at the bit.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about how difficult the book is. And one of the things I was wondering about is that there's so much that is said in the book that we don't say, or that doesn't get talked about, or that can't be talked about that can't be somehow, but you write about how it can't be talked about, and then you did it anyway. So you did it and you talked about it and you wrote it. And I'm really curious about how you experienced that process. And I'm curious about the experience of that process, in part because of my experience as a reader, feeling like I was going to get in trouble because I could see what you were showing us, and I'm not supposed to look there, even though I see it every day. So I was curious about what it means to paint a picture of what people refuse to see about emotional abuse.
I think a lot of work, unfortunately, refers to the bad guy having done some very obscure, bad, vague thing. And that thing is very rarely detailed, and it is very rarely like examined in any real intricacy. And so it's easy to dismiss what you can't see. It's easy to discount something that is not fully formed, that is just kind of alluded to. And that's very commonplace. Like, we have a lot of instances in our own communities in Newfoundland and Labrador and across the country and all across the world where people apologize for things without actually ever acknowledging what it is they're in fact apologizing for. And so that allows a lot of space for unintentional repetition of the behavior, because we never really dissected the behavior. We never really considered what it was they did. It's a lot harder to forgive and give a person a hamburger at the barbecue when you know what it was exactly they have been guilty of performing in their community, in their community space against people that we hold dear and love. And so that was really important to me. Like, it was really important that I stay in the dangerous places and that I remain in the uncomfortable space for long enough to achieve that level of understanding. Because without that level of understanding, you can never really develop compassion for what it is the person has undergone, like what it is they're grappling with. And so we hear people, unfortunately, using very like loose language whereby they suggest that someone should get over it or move on with it, or why can't they, it's this year and we're this way, and how come they can't accept things and like get past it. But it's a much different situation when you know the level of trauma that's occurred. And so I did not want there to be any ambiguity around it. Like, why not just name the thing? And in naming the thing, make it possible for us to be able to identify it. And in identifying it, we can potentially address it in the future. And hopefully, the intention is that this behavior, these kinds of situations, circumstances, scenarios, stop happening. Like, it's intended with all love in my heart to be preventative. It's a preventative measure. I'm like naming the thing so the thing is no longer a problem in the future, so that the same threats that were a part of my girlhood will not be a part of my children's girlhoods, or like will not potentially like impact other vulnerable people. Like, it's the intention around saying the unsaid uncomfortable thing is that I want us to acknowledge it, hold it accountable, and potentially intervene.
Wow, all blessings on you for that.
It is hard.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend like there are not moments, days, whole weeks of writing where I am fully like courageous and believe in everything I'm doing. I have no lack of conviction, but there are moments where you fear that holding your community accountable in this way is going to cause you a lot of personal grief. So there is still like kind of fear in saying the things that people don't want you to say. But I suppose you hope that if it's the right thing, eventually they will be at least be able to understand your reasons for doing so. Even if they don't agree with why, with you saying it, maybe they can have some kind of appreciation for why you felt like you needed to say it. Does that make sense?
That makes so much sense. Heart sense, mind sense, all the sense. You're making it. So thank you.
I just wrote down stay in the dangerous places because that's a great thing to remember for us as writers.
I think one of the dangerous places, I know that Sharon has asked me about this and potentially wanted to talk about this, is the scene at the end of the second section. So the scene at the end of lunch, which is where a lot of people have to put the book down. Readers tell me all the time that they had to take a break at the end of lunch to recover from what happens in that particular section. And I think that's ultimately a good thing because that indicates that you can still feel all of your feelings. Like that demonstrates that you're not a sociopath. Like that this thing that was meant to impact you did have an impact on you. And one of the reasons I stay with Olive for such a long time in that scene is because we never stay with the person experiencing the trauma. Like we only ever visit them prior to the trauma or post-trauma. So we never actually like are fully immersed in their like experience. And I know that's really hard. It was really hard for me to write. I wrote it over Christmas because I knew I needed a block of writing time that I could dedicate solely to this. And that was the only time during that year where I wasn't working on any other projects. And so I guess my point is that I want people to feel even minutely what it is to experience something like that and know that them having read something that was so impactful is nothing, still nowhere near what it is to have to live through it. And it happens every day. And so that's as close as the reader maybe can come to that kind of thing without like feeling harmed. But it also acknowledges that this kind of harm happens. And so it also speaks to the people that have had experiences like that. And so, yes, the dangerous places sometimes need to be lit.
Can I jump in about that scene with a question? Can I railroad this for a second? There was one paragraph in that scene that stood out so much to me. Right with the endings, when you write, no one is suggesting that these men don't exist. Is that in my head I call it the not all men paragraph. And I'm wondering why it's there because I'm pretty sure you have it there on purpose. And I'm curious about the reasons for it. And that if that's like too specific that I've got a question that's got a page number to it, then you can just tell me to talk to you some other day. That's fine. But I was just really curious about the reason for including that there and the choice to include it right in that section.
No problem. It was really intentional. And I was very certain that I was going to have a section in the book where I dealt with the not all men and with the kind of female rally that happens when a male in their community is potentially accused of having perpetrated some malicious act against another female member. I think this is really indicative of a lot of internalized misogyny in our culture. And so as you're like going through that chapter, I'm aware that the reader is saying to themselves, not all men. And I know that they're doing it because we're all doing it, because we don't want to believe that the men in our lives who we care about are capable of doing anything that will be so heinous to someone. And by saying that repeatedly to yourself, you're providing yourself with a lot of distance, right? Like you're allowing yourself not to engage with the scene. You're allowing yourself to remain distant from what it is that Olive is experiencing in that hotel room. And so I acknowledge that potentially not all men are in this hotel room with Olive right now, but these men are. So look at that. And it's a way of like holding the reader accountable and making them refocus their attention on the scene, on the impact of the violence in the scene, rather than making excuses and trying to self-protect, and by extension, protect anyone in their lives that have potentially like hurt someone. And so it was very on purpose. Most of the things that I do in the novel are on purpose. I'm a very purposeful writer. And I hope that it achieves that. Like, I hope that it did pull everyone back in to where they were meant to be engaged. I mean, I guess you guys can tell me if I was successful or not.
I actually found that paragraph a little bit of like a breather, because we're with Olive for this terrible, seemingly unending incident. And like then suddenly the narrator kind of jumps in, pulls us out and says, oh, look at the nice men doing all the nice things. And I have to say, I was so like emotionally, my emotions were up here during that entire scene. Obviously, I'm sure everyone's were. But then in that moment of that paragraph, I like just started laughing because I thought, yeah, of course there are some readers who are sitting there saying, not all men. It was a bit of a break and a relief. And I thought from a craft perspective, that was a genius thing to kind of put in that little breather and then just immediately dive back. And then the other thing is, one of the men who's not in that scene, who's just like exited a second ago, is a completely an enabler. So it's like not just it's not enough to say the good that not every man is in that scene, because some men are not in the scene, but they are almost as guilty. Why didn't he take her? Ugh. Anyway.
Why he didn't take?
I mean, I know why he didn't take her.
So many reasons.
Yeah.
And Calv and men like Calv and people like Calv who are bystanders to violence, who choose to walk away from this situation rather than be involved. We hear all the time now, well, that's not my job. That's not my job, which unfortunately is reflective of our capitalist society, where we feel like we're not responsible for anything unless we're being monetarily compensated for that particular role, because we value our time in such a way. And so, no, it's not any one person's job to ensure that someone is safe in a situation. It is everyone's job. But we've lost that. We're no longer, we don't have the same attachment village functioning that we had one time. Like, we just don't have those same connections. So it's easier to walk away from a person. It is easier, unfortunately, to like leave someone in the path of harm and still feel like you're a good guy. Like, the belief in the good guy, or the good guy's belief in himself, the desire to be known as such, really sometimes hinders their ability to interrupt situations that require their engagement, right? And so all of that is kind of occurring simultaneously inside that scene. Cal breaks people's hearts. Like, my mother is so upset with Cal constantly.
So we have another half hour. Sorry,
No, go
I didn't
ahead.
realize you weren't finished. We have another half hour to go, and we have a question from the editor-in-chief of The Independent, Drew Brown, coming up. But I know that Jason has been dying to ask a question. So sorry. So go for it, Jason.
Oh, that's okay. No, this is the perfect time because my question is kind of on that realm of like the good guy. I mean, I guess not specific to the book, but what the book is, but for the readers and what the book has done and its success. I read it when it came out and it hit really hard. You really like sweep the dirt out from under the rug. You talk about, the abuse, the addiction, the poverty, the prejudice that exists in our city. It exists in every city. But now I revisited the book after, or just recently, and, a lot has changed in a year. Addiction's on the rise, poverty's on the rise. Do you think people now are more apt to be community minded, to want to help each other? Or do you think that people are going to ultimately get more selfish through what we've all kind of gone through? Do you think that like things are going to get better or worse?
Well, things can always get better and they can always get worse. We're in this moment where we actually get to decide what direction we want to take our community in. There are a lot of people calling for collective change, and that inspires me and makes me optimistic about what could potentially happen. But then we see time and time again this consolidation of like power and resources that is really, really staggering. And if we're talking specifically about the precariousness in a lot of the characters in the novel's lives, just think of how the COVID pandemic would have negatively impacted these people, and who would then unfortunately like benefit from their labor, from like literally, not even just figuratively, but literally putting their lives in danger, like on a daily basis. We've seen time and time again the wealthy during this whole last year or 14 months that we've been immersed in the pandemic, profiteering off of our vulnerabilities. They're making more money. They're coming up with new ways to pay us less and give us so little. And while I think there are lots of things that we can be proud of during this most recent crisis, there are a lot of things that we've let go. We keep letting it go over and over and over. We let the bad actors make bad decisions that ultimately make everyone more unsafe. They're just lying to themselves if they think that they're somehow protected in the high tower. They're not. We can only be well if we are all well collectively. And I think with climate change and or global heating, which is what I call it most of the time now, but I'm not gonna get too political all up in here. But I think as we see like these systems that have been fraught with inequality and abuse for hundreds, if not thousands of years, kind of come together in this combustion engine of COVID-19 pandemic, I think what we need to do is collectively hold people accountable for thieving. There's a lot of thieving going on around here.
That's the thing I found about the book, and that this has been said already, is that the characters aren't, you kind of empathize with all of them. And I think that what you've done is not to try to get people to like or dislike people, but to understand people. And I think that's the only way we are going to get to a better place, if we start seeing and understanding everyone's circumstance and where we've all come from.
Yes, and that's not to excuse bad behavior. Like,
no.
I'm in no way trying to make excuses for any of the characters who are trapped in these like vicious cycles of self-destruction and further damaging almost everyone they come in contact with in the book, unfortunately. I'm just trying to like achieve some level of awareness, like some level of like comprehension. Like a lot of people don't have any notion of how difficult lives can be. Like a lot of people in our community, in our cities, they are rude to the girl at the the retail clerk. They bark at the cashier at the gas station. They have no patience at all for the person sanitizing the cart at the grocery store. And I think this is really unfortunate because that's someone's, like, that person is struggling. That's someone's kid, like, you're yelling at. Like, how come you can't find, like, some love in your heart for that person? How come you can't cultivate generosity towards them? And I think ultimately that's what fiction can do. Like, that's what storytelling is intended for. We're meant to tell stories so that our imagination can allow us to be in the other person's body to some degree, so that we can then move toward them in a kinder and gentler way.
I agree. We got to start putting ourselves in each other's shoes.
So Megan, there's one more Grand Falls person to ask the question tonight. And that's Drew Brown. He's the editor-in-chief of The Independent and a Memorial alumnus. And he's also a columnist for Vice Canada, and his work has appeared on CBC, in the Newfoundland Quarterly, The Deep, The Scope, The Overcast, The Guardian. Yeah, here's Drew.
Hey Meg, Drew Brown here. I'm a big fan of small game hunting at the local Coward Gun Club. I actually couldn't put it down the first time I read it. I plowed through it in one continuous sitting, which I actually don't think I was supposed to do, because when I was finished, I just spent probably a solid hour sobbing. And to be fair, there is literally a warning on the very first page that this might hurt a little, so that's totally my bad. But seriously, it is a beautiful and necessary kind of pain. The book is painful in the way like a good therapy session is painful, reopening and cleaning out our deepest wounds in order that we might finally begin to heal from them and stop inflicting new ones on ourselves and others. So in my reading, unacknowledged trauma and the great and occasionally violent lengths to which many characters go to avoid acknowledging or confronting it is at the core of this novel, and a big part of why it so powerfully addresses the Newfoundland condition and the reckoning our generation is now having with itself and its past, present, and future here. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you understand trauma's role in Newfoundland culture and what you think the collective healing process looks like. Thank you.
So Megan, Drew is asking about unacknowledged trauma, and what is the role of unacknowledged trauma in the Newfoundland, what he calls the Newfoundland condition. So his question is, you know, like your characters going to violent lengths occasionally to watch, to avoid confronting their trauma or their emotions, that's the core of the book. Why it so powerfully addresses the Newfoundland condition and the reckoning our generation is now having with itself, its past, present, and future here. Can you tell us a bit about how you understand trauma's role in Newfoundland culture and what you think the healing process might look like?
Yep. So I think just recently, last week, in fact, there were statistics released about our health outcomes here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so these things kind of dealt with the biocycle kind of social deterrents that would negatively impact our health outcomes. And so, unfortunately, for many of us, things are not looking great. In fact, we had some of the, if not worst, rates of smoking and drinking, terrible diet. Life expectancy was not the national average. We really were found to be struggling in almost every single section that would potentially negatively impact our quality of life. Then there was this other question, which a lot of the media outlets like to focus on, where we also then defined ourselves as being the least stressed. And so these two things are not they can't coexist. And what I think is really telling about this is how poorly we are at self-assessment. Because if we have some of the highest rates of premature preventable death in our country, then logically we can't possibly be the least stressed group of people in this place we call Canada. And so I think our inability to even articulate our trauma, because we are so colonized to the point of being unable to discuss our suffering or our pain or our hardship in any way that would not lead to like further shame or guilt, makes us unable entirely to address the stress in our lives, like the chronic, debilitating stress that a lot of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians experience. And I mean, we've not been having like a great go of it these last 400 or 500 years. So to suggest that like things have all been peachy keen is kind of ridiculous. Like what makes us respond to how's it going, goodbye, when things are not good? What makes us hide our challenges from each other? Why can't we express ourselves? Like, I know there are so many concurrent reasons why we have difficulty acknowledging that things are going poorly. And ultimately, I think this re-traumatizes the population. And I think possibly our fear that we will somehow incriminate our loved ones prevents us from acknowledging that things have been less than desirable. Like we fear that that will some way be a betrayal to our family or our community or our place if we in any way criticize that place. And so we choose not to. And in choosing not to, we repress the truth. We don't acknowledge the reality of our lives. And unfortunately, this is not controversial. Like, I'm just like stating facts here. When you repress like the reality of stress in your life, you are more susceptible to autoimmune diseases and degenerative conditions, which are really prevalent in Newfoundland and Labrador. Like, we have a lot of these conditions, these chronic conditions. And I think it is related to our inability to confront the things that are causing us pain, like that are causing us grief. And it doesn't mean that you're not loved. It doesn't mean that your parents didn't do everything they could for you. Of course they did. Of course you're loved. And of course you're valuable. In fact, acknowledging some of the things that were like less than positive in your life means that you're comfortable with that. Like, I think the way I think of my approach to my home is very much like I'm honest with my community. And that honesty is a sign of my respect for Newfoundland and Newfoundlanders. I think it's far more disrespectful to lie to someone's face about what you think they're capable of. So when I say, I don't like that behavior, I think we can do better, I'm actually it's a vote of confidence. Like, I believe we can be better. I believe Newfoundland can be more just and healthier and stronger and thriving for like the future generations. I haven't given up on us. I'm still invested. And so the first step is acknowledging that violent, negative things have happened. And maybe, possibly, hopefully, we can address those things and move past it.
We need the Megan Coles 12-step program for Newfoundland.
There'll be so many steps. There'll be way more steps than 12.
I think Heidi and Janet have some questions now from listeners, from viewers.
Yes, I do. We're going to switch gears a little bit and swoop back to the craft side a little bit. We've got a question from Bridget Canning, who asks, how does your writing practice or headspace in general change when you shift from writing fiction, novels, or short stories to plays and poetry?
So I've been doing that a lot recently. I just finished the copy of my poetry collection and sent it to the publisher for layout. And then I had to shift directly into playwriting. So I'm working on something for my PhD. And I think the level of structured thinking that a play requires is very different. Like it's it's much more concrete, and that requires me to be thinking in a much more kind of foundational way. So I'm constantly thinking about how the different components move on stage. So it requires a level of visualization that is not necessarily needed when I'm working on a poem. Like a poem is visually acknowledged on the page, but is not a visual representation on stage in the same way that a play would be. The play also requires me to be very engaged in like dialect. And so I have to really enter into a voice space in a way that I might not necessarily have to do with a piece of prose, for example. The prose, which is really its own beast, again, allows me to be interior in a way that the play does not. Like the play has to be much more active. And so all three of these different genres or mediums require different focuses, but I think ultimately they all kind of feed into the same storytelling instinct, which is to like find the most effective, impactful way to communicate with the reader or the audience member or the listener. I hope that is helpful, or at least somewhat of an answer.
Great answer, I think. We have another question now. It's a comment/question. I listened to the audiobook and I thought it was the best performance of an audiobook I've ever experienced. Indeed, I think this book must be experienced that way. And perhaps as a play. Any thoughts, plans of turning it into a play or film?
Okay, so I have considered both of these things, and I have outlawed theater, or have chosen to stay away from the theater. I have a very kind of personal reason for that, but also like a very kind of collective reason for that, and that when you're bringing an audience into the theater, there's no way to be constantly like garnering consent. And this kind of subject matter, like any intimate thing, requires constant consent. Like you have to be checking in with the person and allowing them the potential to remove themselves from a damaging situation, because there are aspects of the novel, there are aspects of this story that would be very triggering. And I don't know if I would feel comfortable having someone feel trapped inside of the social construct that a theater requires. And so I chose to set it in prose format because it allows the reader their kind of autonomy. They can choose when, if they need to take a break, to recover, to put the book down, maybe never pick it up again. I don't know. It allows people to enter and engage with the story on their own terms. And I think that's important when you're doing this kind of really taxing work. I would be very upset if I had put someone in a position where my work harmed them further rather than help them heal and or discover something about themselves. Now, I do think I'll potentially consider an adaptation for the screen, because the screen does not have the same social requirements that a theater has. Like you have the same ability to dictate your experience when you're approaching something on a device, like whether it is a television show or a film or whatnot. We can dictate whether or not we want to engage with it further. And so I'll probably like work towards something, but it probably won't be a play.
I've got a question from YouTube. The question is, you seem to have a bone to pick with townies, and you almost mock the patrons of the restaurant as if they know nothing about rural Newfoundland. So where does this fit into the theme? That's a very brave question. I would never ask you that.
I don't know if I have a bone to pick with all townies. I certainly have issues with some people who uphold classist views about people from other regions and or demographics. And so I wouldn't specifically refer to them as townies necessarily. There are a lot of other colorful words we could use to describe them. We'll let our minds run wild with that one. I do think that we don't necessarily acknowledge the rural-urban divide in a way that is helpful to overcome it. When we were speaking about the audiobook, one of the reasons I thought it was necessary that I read the audiobook or narrate the audiobook is because a lot of rural Newfoundlanders and Labradorians still experience quite a bit of discrimination with regards to their accents. And there are not voices that we necessarily hear in positions of authority. Or unfortunately, people have a preconceived notion that somehow your ability to like conjugate a verb or articulate a sentence in a certain pronunciation is reflective of your intelligence level. And that I find really damaging. Like it really doesn't get us any further ahead. It kind of keeps us trapped in this like divisive place where we disregard each other because we don't sound the same way, rather than having an appreciation for our richness and like our varying perspectives. With regards to like disliking townies, like I'm married to a townie and my best friends are townies. I suppose my baby is going to be half townie or whatever. That's the thing, a hybrid of sorts. I don't think that I enter into any relationship deciding whether or not I like a person or not based on their background. It's their behavior that dictates whether or not I think they're kind of worth my time.
Good answer. Here's another one. We're just going to sort of reframe it a little bit, but we're wondering, how do you think your characters from the book are doing these days, sort of past the time frame of the novel? So if there was a sequel, not that there would be, I don't think, but what do you think they're doing?
But what are they doing? Do you know what? This is such a trick question. My mother and my father both asked me what happens to Olive and Iris when they think I'm not paying attention. Like, it's very important for people to know what happens next in that particular storyline. I think there's probably people who evolve and hopefully overcome some of the obstacles in their lives. And I think there are other characters that unfortunately may be lost to us because some people are unfortunately irreparable in ways that are very heartbreaking. Like, I don't know that we can expect Roger to have like an enlightenment moment or not. Like, I don't know if he's capable of it given his lived experience, or then where this all goes. I mean, I think we have to also, when we're thinking about the characters in the book, but also the characters in our towns and communities, we have to wonder what resources are available for them to even overcome these obstacles. I mean, we have a system, we have a number of systems that are failing in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it's not the people inside the system that are failing us. Don't misunderstand. When I say that the mental health care system is insufficient, I am not criticizing the doctors and nurses and care workers and social workers. I am not criticizing the people inside that system that are trying to support one another and their clients and their patients. I'm criticizing the system for being inadequate. It's not enough. Like, if it were up to me, if I was in charge of like outlining a 12-step program for nursing, for Newfoundland, for recovery, for healing, I'd have everybody in counseling. Like, I'd have everybody, man, pop, every aunt, uncle, like, they would hate it. I would be so much kale, it would be crazy. I'd be like, leafy greens for everyone. But, you know, that would probably be a bit of a dictatorship. So perhaps I shouldn't be the only person in charge. Perhaps we should all be making these decisions together. My point being is that what resources do the characters have available to them that would make their future better? Like, what job opportunities, what education opportunities, what support systems? Are there even people in their lives that they can tell this to? Like, some people, some of the characters don't even know how to express what has occurred. You know, like, we watch Damien, for example, struggle to express what is occurring in his life. And he doesn't actually achieve that. And I hope for him. So just as I hope for all of them, just as I hope for all of us. And that's not what you want to know. You want to know who lives and dies and who goes to jail, but I'm not telling you that.
Do you have any other questions from YouTube, Janet?
No.
So just before we end, maybe we want to go around the circle here in the book club, in the little squares, the Hollywood circle, the Hollywood squares, with Jason first. Jason, do you have another question for Megan? You're muted. You win the award for muting.
Hi there. I'm not sure if I have anything off the top of my head at this second. I'm so engaged with everyone's questions about the book. I guess not this book, but what are your next plans? What are your next big projects?
Oh, okay. Well, I've written a poetry collection that will be coming out in September called Satched. And it is probably the most autobiographical piece of work that I've ever published. And it is me, in many ways, putting my money where my mouth is. And so I'm acknowledging the things that I've experienced in my life that were less than favorable, in the hopes that that would give other people courage to kind of embrace some of their less than favorable lived experiences. The first poem.
I look forward to it. That's very courageous to be so personal too. So thanks for that.
Oh yeah, like, I mean, I've sent it around to all my cousins and everyone, and I was like, this is what I'm doing, guys. Just because I don't want anyone to feel taken aback by some of the things that I say, but mostly it's me like coming to terms with like intergenerational stuff, which I think is important. And I'm not asking Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to do the hard work on themselves while not doing the hard work myself. Like, I think we all have to kind of take responsibility for our own trajectory, and that way we can support each other better. And so that's that little project. The first poem in the collection is actually called I Have Been a Messy Bitch. And so that's how we're going to introduce that content to the world. And I'm writing a play about Muskrat Falls. So that's going to be a doozy. It's quite a large undertaking, and it may never see the light of day because I'm trying to create a playwriting process that has meaningful inclusion and full consent with all of the vested parties. And so part of that is I've just decided that I'm going to invest my own personal time and artistic and intelligence into a project that potentially will be buried if collective consensus cannot be achieved. And in a way, that is meant to kind of be an example of consultation. Because it's not really consultation if everyone's already decided they're going to do whatever they want, right? And so I'm dealing with a lot of that in the Muskrat Falls play. And I'm always writing fiction. I'm probably going to write another novel. It won't be in a restaurant. There might be a hospital. Stuff like that.
Do you have another question?
I do. I have one more. So I read this quote a few months ago from Eden Robinson, the novelist Eden Robinson. She says, we should always be changed in some way by every story we write. Do you feel like small game hunting changed you in any way? The process of writing it.
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of conviction about what kind of writer I wanted to be, what kind of storyteller I wanted to be. I kind of had a notion of what I wanted to be striving for. And while I was touching it, or I was nearing it in the plays, and I was kind of circling it in eating habits, I never fully landed on it. And maybe that was inexperience, maybe that was fear of repercussions or rejection, or maybe it was maturity. Like sometimes you gotta live through stuff before you gotta process your own skill level before you can actually then execute what it is you're trying to do. And I think all artists understand that, like this notion that you have an idea of the kind of art you want to make and the kind of artist that you want to be, yet you're not yet matured to the place where you can actually execute the caliber of your idea. And so small game hunting at the local Coward Gun Club was probably the first time I really felt like I am executing who I think I want to be in the world and the kind of work that I want to contribute to my arts and cultural community. Like it felt like a realization that this is the right direction for me. And that gave me more conviction. So watch out.
Dr. Craig, did you have another question before we end tonight?
No, because the third question that I thought of in advance, you've already answered and some. But what a real gift it is to talk with you about this work. It's good heart medicine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Megan. And thanks also to Sharon and to Jason Sellars and Dr. Craig from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and John Duff, our tech guru, and Janet and Heidi for all their help in producing this event. And before we end, we always announce the next selection for the next Coastlines Book Club. And the next selection is Sonia Boone's book, What the Oceans Remember. Dr. Boone is a brilliant researcher, writer, and the best teacher and prof of gender studies here at MUN. And this amazing memoir will take you from the west coast of Africa to the Netherlands and Suriname and Uttar Pradesh, all places. And you will never You will never look at the sort of the slavery question and the Atlantic Ocean in the same way after reading this book. That's what I believe. So that's the next book. Get reading, everybody. And thank you to Megan Gail Coles and to everyone who participated tonight. And we look forward to seeing you in July to discuss Dr. Boone's book. So thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.